With the devastating and potentially explosive events taking place in southern Israel, I decided that I was going to analyze the outcome of this war based on Sun Tzu's theory, Art of War. I guess many of you are familiar with the name, but for those who are not, who is Sun Tzu? Just only a Chinese general and military strategist who wrote the most prominent book on the theory of war and how to think about war. He lived around 6th century BCE. Today, his book and his strategies are taught in every military academy and is even used in the sphere of business. So I saw it fit to use his theories for fundamental analysis of the possible outcomes of this war. Sun Tzu theorized that there are fundamentally five factors that determine the outcome of a war. I would deviate a little, especially in the modern world, because I believe there is a sixth factor. There is something that didn't exist as prominent as it exists today in Sun Tzu's time. I believe that the mass media, the extensive mass media that we have right now, can and do in many ways impact the outcome of a war. Either side can use extensive propaganda to full effect and can influence the minds of the people who support their war effort and can also terrorize the mind of the people who they are fighting against. I believe in this conflict there will be a vigorous fight for the hearts and minds of people globally. And in a modern world where open conflict is frowned upon and devastating consequences to civilians is frowned upon, care has to be taken as to how much that can impact a war. And there are numerous examples where the impact of the mass media has influenced the outcome of a war. And we don't have to look very far back. Some may say that the end of the Vietnam War was actually encouraged by mass media. Some may say that America lost its appetite for the war after seeing some of the most brutal and carnage filled events that were taking place during the war. And that in itself may have influenced public opinion and would have led to a withdrawal from Vietnam. Okay, let's begin. What are those five factors Sun Tzu mentions? These five factors are morality, the leader, method and discipline, heaven and earth, and terrain. These five factors, according to Sun Tzu, determines the outcome of a war. So we will take a look at them individually. And when Sun Tzu talks about morality, we're not talking about morality in the simplistic form that we are accustomed to, where he says, oh, you should treat me good, I should treat you good. No, no, no. And Sun Tzu talks about morality in the sense of the connection between the leader of a state and its people. Here he talks about a leader being so trustworthy, so confident, so benevolent, so kind, so loved by his people that they would follow him to the ends of the earth. And all this will be done without regard to their life. That the leader's army will have such love, such dedication, such belief, and such trust that the people or the army would have such love, such trust, such belief in their leader and the rightfulness of his cause that they will be willing to lay their life down to protect the state and to fight for the state. Method and discipline is pretty obvious. Method and discipline talks about how the army is organized, their subdivisions, their operational ability to fight. How effective is the army? He talks about there being a constancy of rewards and punishment. How structured is the army? how proficient is the training, and how much clarity every soldier gets and every commander gets so that he can perform his duty with efficiency. Enough about method and discipline. Let's talk about the general. The general is, as Sun Tzu says, the bulwark of the army. And this is pretty obvious. If you got a good general, and you got, well, in modern times, we're talking about generals, and you have competent leaders of the army who can wage war, then you're on the right side. So Sun Tzu says that general should be respected. That general should be able to motivate his soldiers. That general should clearly communicate his intentions and should be filled with strategic prowess. Let's talk about heaven. Heaven, in Sun Tzu's perception, refers to stuff like the weather, climate. These things can have major impacts on armies. And we can see the impact of the weather on a planned invasion. As we can see, recently, Israel stalled their planned invasion. And what was the reason? Because there was too much cloud cover. We'll talk now about the terrain. The terrain should be obvious. Are there places for proper concealment? Are there places for proper approach to the enemy? Are there places for proper cover? So the geography of the area impacts the movement and the tactical dispositions of the army. Back in the days of Sun Tzu, it was important to hold the high ground. Nowadays, the advantage is not as critical, especially with air power and naval power. There's a lot of things that could even the playing field, even if you held the high ground. So it's also very critical for an approaching army to be very familiar with the terrain that they are about to attack. That way, they can decide which is the quickest route to get to the enemy. They can decide where there's possible protected paths to the enemy. They can decide places where they believe the enemy might strongly protect. They can decide places where they believe the enemy might be weak. So now let's take a look at how these five factors apply to the current situation between Israel and Palestine. Now let's take a look at the first factor, morality. And this is a little bit controversial because morality in this situation tend to imply the rightfulness of the cause, how much the parties involved believe in the rightfulness of their cause, and how much they are willing to follow their leader into the path of war. So I'm not going to say too much about it, but I can say that prior to the initiation of the conflict in southern Israel, there was some sort of divide in the Israeli government. And quite possibly, how does that affect the current situation? Are the people of Israel going to rally firmly around the leadership? I believe it's possible, considering how devastating the incursions were in southern Israel. At the same time, it's quite possible that there may be some resentment towards Benjamin Netanyahu's government for not being able to prevent it. Then what about Hamas? How does the people of Palestine rally around Hamas? How motivated, how concentrated would be the power of Hamas? I think also with the devastating consequences of the bombing on Palestinian civilians, this may also be factored in to the strategy of Israel to make it so punitive that that way the civilian population would want to distance itself from Hamas, would want to discourage the civilian population to support Hamas. So I think that's probably part of the calculation. I also believe that because, in some respects, politically, the Prime Minister of Israel is fighting for his survival, he would definitely be not in any position to show weakness or lack of response. That being said, let's look at the factors of method and discipline and the general. The method and discipline, because Israel is such a standardized army, and there would be an emphasis on method and discipline. We have seen the operational capabilities of Israel. I think they have loads of experience in doing this. I think also they may have very proficient commanders. So I think those two factors will tip in the favor of Israel. And the reason being also, we have to understand that Hamas is not a conventional standardized army and is more of a paramilitary force. That does not say that there isn't an emphasis on method and discipline and there aren't capable, competent leaders and commanders. But I think those two factors are tipped in the favor of Israel. Well, now let's take a look at the weather or heaven, as Sun Tzu calls it. He has also said Sun Tzu basically combines heaven and earth, and there's an element of earth in terms of distances and measurements and stuff like that. But heaven in this case, as I've said, refers to the weather. And we have seen how impactful the weather can be. A matter of fact, Israel has stalled or postponed its intended invasion because of inclement weather. That factor seems to affect a more standardized, conventional army because of how much there is reliant on, let's say, satellite systems. And this, in some respects, if the weather is not, and there's a lot of um, cloud cover, that could definitely affect the performance or the efficiency of those weapon systems that rely on, let's say, GPS or something like that. So that could considerably affect a more standardized, conventional army than a more paramilitary force, which will rely more heavily on sorts of guerrilla tactic, so to speak. So let's talk about the terrain right now. Terrain, and we've seen this before. For example, in Stalingrad, because of the massive bombardment by Israel, what basically they have done, they have created ample opportunities for Hamas for extreme cover and concealment. So I believe that Israel would take into consideration that calculus, that going into Gaza would be something that's very dangerous, especially with all the debris that has been created by bombardment. And it's quite possible that that will be places where traps can be set. And it's not it's a very ugly situation to be going into in terms of infantry forces. Even with mechanized infantry, it's still a very difficult situation. Again, we have to believe that with the devastating incursions in southern Israel and all that has taken place, there is a possibility that Hamas would have calculated that there would be retributive justice and would, in some way, would have prepared for the possibility of an incursion in Gaza. If that is the case, then it will make it even more extremely difficult for the Israeli army. So basically, we have two factors each for both sides in this conflict. Then again, remember, I did say I believe there is a sixth factor, especially in the modern world, and that is the factor of mass media. And of course, for many obvious reasons, this one I believe would be tipped in the favor of Israel. Well, initially, it seemed like it was, especially after the devastating attacks in southern Israel. There would have been sympathy, and many people would have rallied to the side of Israel. And but we have to be careful with that particular factor because now that a lot of things are becoming apparent in Gaza, especially with a lot of civilian deaths, it's quite possible that could change public opinion and that could have some effect on exactly what takes place in terms of a military campaign into Gaza. So that is something that would have to be considered in the big scheme of the six factors that affect the outcome of the war. I believe that this is still being played out in terms of the media. So it's quite possible we have to wait and see the impact it's going to have and how it affects the whole dynamic of the campaign. So there you have it. We've done an analysis based on Sun Tzu's fundamental factors affecting the outcome of a war. Um, Tell me your thoughts. Of course, if neighboring states get involved and quite possibly the US gets involved, that changes the whole dynamic of the conflict, and that will require an entirely different analysis. So, as I said, please comment below. Tell me what your thoughts are. You may have an entirely different vision of the possibilities for the outcomes of this war. I hope there is some sort of possibility for some diplomacy. As I said, every major Western leader is scurrying over to the Middle East and trying to meet with all the parties involved and neighboring parties, and hopefully they can be some sort of resolution without more bloodshed and carnage. And sadly, in this conflict, as is seen, the people that are bearing the brunt of the onslaught in this conflict are civilians. On that note, have a good night, hope for peace, and we will see how this all turns out.